Well, you're doing just
Where is
fine.
my husband, Tony Curtis or Richard Burton? Which one am I married to at the moment?
I don't know. That seems like a personal choice. I should let you. That's wonderful. Yeah, I think it's always lovely to be able to kind of keep spirits up in times like these through remembering ways that creative outlets can help us escape
Right.
from sitting in it at all times, right?
And Megan, with my sense of humor, I have asked people to create a children's rhyme that was created. I know it in English, so I theorize it came from England, but maybe it was translated from French or German or whatever, because it was European based. Ring around the rosy,
Yeah.
pocket full of posy, ashes, ashes, they all fell down. That happened from the Black Plague in 1368 in Europe,
Yeah.
when like half of Europe was died.
Yeah. 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 And they didn't know what to do, so they would just like build a new town on top of the old town, which I thought was brazen, right? Like let's just start over on top of this city. Like super
Uh,
intense.
Monty Python in their film Search for the Holy Grail show a scene in a village in England. Of course, they're doing English parody,
Uh-huh.
where they're going on a wagon through a village saying, "Bring out your dead, bring out your dead." And of course, one of the comedians going, "I'm not dead, I'm just drunk."
That's funny. Yeah, I wish Monty Python was still making new movies. That would be a lovely thing.
Well, someone with probably comic liberty, and I'm not sure a comedic license, took some bubble words and overwrote the script of
Oh,
the closing scene of that film, but had everyone situationally retitled by moment. The person who was King Arthur was Donald Trump,
oh wow.
and the gentleman with the horned helmet was Dr. Fauci,
Wow.
and then all the other knights were the cohorts of Donald Trump, all representing the different champions of idiocy who are trying to battle this rabbit, which is the guardian of the Holy Grail, who represents how rodent-like and mischievous COVID is. Of course, the little rabbit starts killing all of them, and they start, retreat, retreat.
Oh wow.
But I think that was a good commentary on the current situation using old parody.
Yeah. Yeah.
As particularly from the legend of King Arthur, which is so fabricated.
Yeah, it's amazing how many of those myths you can replant in a new decade and they still have relevant themes.
Yes, and there is they're attacking myths in Europe, particularly recent royalty, as there has been accusations, historical accusations against Americans about their relationship to slavery and segregation. We need to change the name of Mark Twain School and and Lowell School, and but
yeah, I've been working on a lot of them.
and particularly Leopold II, the king of Belgium, and just how horrific he was to the Congolese. But then there's also critical analysis of Saint Nicholas.
Oh yeah.
In Europe, particularly because of his nemesis, Black Peter.
Oh yes. Oof.
And what is the basis of Black Peter? It's kind of like looking for the origin. It was this really, was it changed from one generation to the other?
Well, I'm going to get us started here since it's 2:00. Those Welcome to everyone. I'm Pastor Megan Rohrer. I'm the pastor of Grace Lutheran here in San Francisco, and we are beginning our town hall on how we can imagine ways to minimize bias in the Lutheran Church. If you are joining us on Zoom, below is the chat function where you can feel free to offer comments to each other and share insights that you have. If you would like to lift up questions for today's guest, if you could do so in the Q&A tab, that would be really helpful and would make it easier to lift up those questions. For those who are joining us on Facebook Live, you can just type any questions you might have into the comment section and I will lift them up here. And let's see. It's important to know that the comments that are being provided today are comments coming from November 6, 2020. So if you're watching this archived conversation at some later date and time, please presume that both myself and our guests today have learned more things that we can only learn in the future, that better language has come along and that we're a part of that. That the Holy Spirit comes to us in very unique and varied ways. And so we're going to speak to our own personal experiences, and some of our own personal experiences might be relevant to communities beyond ourselves, but neither of us are going to speak on behalf of full communities or groups of people. We're simply folk who are having a conversation and sharing what we know, with the hope that sharing some of our stories might help shape your story into the future. With that, I would like to invite you to introduce yourself, illustrious guest.
Oh, thank you, Megan Rohrer, or to go into the full high church praxis. Dear Reverend Dr. Megan Rohrer, pastor of Grace Lutheran Church, ELCA, San Francisco, California, United States of America.
I like it. Thank you.
Okay. My name is John Alexander Lowell. I am speaking to you from the patio of the building I work in San Francisco, the city in which I live and work in the city in which an event happened 19 and a half years ago that changed my life, in the context of I became a biological and legal other because I sustained disabling injuries, particularly, and I will change the angle of my head so you may see the side effect of what surgery does to attend to the injuries I sustained on March 23rd, 2001, as I was going westward on foot on the sidewalk on 14th Street, a car driving northward on Mission ran through the red light and hit me. I was told, after I was well enough and on reduced medicine to be able to retain information and process it, because I went through intensive mental and physical rehabilitation in inpatient care, that I was told by my partner, Michael, and my parents, oh, John, it was said that you flew 20 feet in the air and then landed on Mission Street, and you landed on your head. And that's how you sustained brain damage. And it took a while, Megan and my peers listening, for me to kind of learn to understand what that meant. Because I woke up an other in the hospital, an intubated and medicated patient with in the need of a lot of medical care and compassion from family members and my partner, Michael. So I learned from this brain damage, which is called traumatic brain injury, that I needed to have part of my skull replaced, and I needed to have permanent, well, it's determined by my neurosurgeon to be permanently there, a shunt installed in my forehead, because aspects of my brain, which metaphorically is like a sponge, which helps drain off spinal tap fluid, is gone. Here's a word that, to use modern lexicon, Google it. It's called hydrocephalus. I have hydrocephalus. Water swelling in the brain, so it needs to drain it. So it goes down my neck, and sometimes people may think as if I'm having a blood rush of adrenaline and I'm about to go berserk because, I have swelling blood vessels on my head and my neck. No, I am passive at the moment. It's just a permanent tube that sticks out of my head and my neck. Because you may have seen that, attendees, and you, Megan, have too, or maybe if you looked in the mirror when you were raging mad at somebody, you see, your blood pressure goes up and your blood vessels swell. Well, no, mine, it's not the side effect of that, but that's how people have perceived me because of the brain damage. And why do you have that on your head? What happened to you? And some people, out of ignorance and curiosity, they will ask a question point blank, which I'm fine with. I don't have any insecurities regarding that. But I try and honestly answer it without going into too much terminology. To use simple lexicon is easier in explaining what happened to me. And I don't wish to scare people either. So that is a little bit what happened to me. And I spoke of my partner, Michael. Yes, I identify in demographic terms as gay. So I am a gay guy with a disability living in San Francisco. And I situationally, and how I met you, Megan, and I'm sure you must have good memory. Well, it's a general assumption that you have good memory. I don't scale people on that. It's a generalization I make, pardon me. That I met you when I became a lay minister member of First Congregational Church of San Francisco. And that church and others in the neighborhood of what Polk Gulch, kind of west side of Russian Hill, California Street, were all participants in what you were the coordinator of, Welcome Ministry, which was housed in Old First Presbyterian Church at the corner of Sacramento and Van Ness Avenue. And I decided to agree to be on the board of it in a way representing First Congregational Church of San Francisco. And that's how I met you and all the other board members at the monthly meetings that occurred in the lower levels of that old brick church. And I understood some of the context of your ministry, Megan, and how your methodology of how you worked with, and I learned from you, Megan, the power of the word with. And I don't know enough Latin either way, but I did in my studies at a seminary, which we both, I believe, went to Pacific School of Religion. I had some casual learning of Latin, and I learned the Latin word for with, and that is cum, C-U-M. And I can see some similarities to the English word of C-O-M-E. I developed a little bit of often would do it as a closing line in an email called a signature. It would be cum Deus e pluribus unum, which reflects my theosophy. With God, from many we are one. With God. I'm a with it kind of minister in the United Church of Christ.
Yeah, I would agree that you're very with it. And so like I think I met you maybe almost 18 years ago now, because I started in 2002. And one of the things that was really helpful, because I at the time I was working every single day with the homeless and hungry, but the not only was it revelatory for me to learn about the changes that can happen for those who survive car accidents or pedestrian car collisions, is that the effects on the brain, if you're not aware of what a traumatic brain injury is, or a TBI, some people call it, can be something that people assume is something that is like a mental health issue. And I think there have been studies in the last decade that talk about an overwhelming number of people who live on the streets who are mistakenly believed to have severe mental health issues often have traumatic brain injuries. And they're misunderstood from the world about how their brain operates, and this misunderstanding about how their brain has been changed creates really significant barriers for them in housing and in relating with their family, and everyone's symptoms are really different. But I'm wondering if you could talk about like what are some of the symptoms that people might see in someone who has a traumatic brain injury, in case people haven't heard of it before.
Component that is to a degree in rehabilitation addressed by what's called a speech pathologist is effective relearning how to speak. And this is also effect of memory and capacity to tap into the memory bank of which word to use, of stuttering and pace of kind of speaking too fast, or do we slow, you have slow cadence in how you're talking, either or. People are confused and can misconstrue you because of another physical side effect, which I had. It's called, because of the injuries I sustained in my face, there was the misalignment. I had what was called extropia of my eyeballs. Why entropia, a common term for that, is called being cross-eyed, where your pupils are focused inward. My pupils were focused outward. So if I was stuttering and my eyeballs were pointing outward and I was not speaking properly, situation could have thought I was inebriated, or, as what we have some experience with in our work and ministry on Polk Street, for people not being able to differentiate between standard condition, well, I don't know if it's standard necessarily, but being intoxicated, and also having a symptom of mental illness. And that's worth another discussion at another time of how the police and social workers don't know how to tell the difference between apples and oranges and all the fruit on the sidewalk. So that was that's a symptom that I had, was speaking. And also relative to people I have met in my, say, social encounters or group therapy discussions with people with brain injury, it's called post-traumatic stress disorder. and it's very relative to how one was injured, whether, there was a smell in the air, or whether you had some taste in your mouth because you'd just eaten caramel corn. And so forever, that taste of caramel corn just commonly put freaks you out. Well, I had side effect of hearing a dramatization. It's often done in entertainment where you replicate a scene of a wreck. It's just the sound of a crash would throw me off, and especially someone crying out for help. And even fresh out of the hospital, because even though the collision, as I described, happened in March 2001, I was released from inpatient care in April 2002. For a year or two afterwards, if I even heard a screech of wheels or a car horn, I was just a little alarmed. It wouldn't create a panic, but I was kind of nervous. That's scaled down, Megan, but it empirically, rationally, it's still, a car horn is still there for a purpose, to alert the driver, hopefully, that something is of danger to them or you as they're driving by. I am attentive to that, so I at least did not lose my hearing abilities. But one side effect, and this is more doctors, is there are many different types of doctors out there. These are called ENTs, ear, nose, throat. Doctors, my primary care physician referred me to an ENT to determine why I could not smell that well anymore. And I had asked my neurosurgeon and my neurologist, why do you think I have a reduced scale ability to smell, while I can smell a garlic clove if it's right here, but I cannot smell a waif of sulfur or flatulence in the room, or perfume? And they said, well, maybe because the segment of the brain that picks up on smell and taste is right there in between kind of your temple. I don't know. I don't know enough, and an ENT couldn't tell me enough. But that is a physical ailment I still stick with. But the last one that I have permanently because of the brain damage is, I don't know enough to tell you exactly why, other than the brain damage caused it. I would have a grand mal seizures were I not on medicine that reduces the chance that I have grand mal seizures, or I used adrenaline stimulating or high blood pressure stimulating narcotics, which I would never do that, because that can turn your brain on and just cause your brain to spasm out and have an epileptic seizure, which I have had several of them because I was not on right dosage of my medicine. But that prompted me, Megan, in my studies at Pacific School of Religion, which I began there for my Master's of Divinity degree under the auspices of what was needed in the United Church of Christ to become a minister. I learned segments in the Bible where there was a description of a child, a boy, having seizures, and the father reacting to it and seeking out aid from Jesus Christ and the disciples of Jesus Christ to help them out, and situationally how that was described and also known as misunderstood by the authors of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's not described in the Gospel of John, but how it's described there, and even and of course, the Bible has been translated so many times, from Candy Greek to Latin to German, French, English, and then American English, and then now, progressive American English. The description in English has the child in the Gospel of Matthew description as being called both epileptic and demonic. And in the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke, it's more a spirit is in him. So there's all sorts of scale of terms, and that is a little bit of the basis of some of the symptoms of the disease of otherisms, is what terms are used and who came up with the term. I don't know, and I was not back there. And talking to former Congressman Anthony or Tony Coelho, who was representing some district in the East Bay, and he was one of the House sponsors of the Americans with Disabilities Act, nor the former senator from Kansas, I think Harkin or Hawkins, and Orrin Hatch, and then maybe Senator Ted, short for Theodore Kennedy, were the early advocates in the Senate version of that. Whether they had invented the term disabled, or had they asked a civil rights advocacy group, which terms have changed over them, and I don't know enough history on that to say how the terms have changed of what its name was then, but to say, where did you come with the term disabled, which is a scaled word of not abled. And on abilities, it's like abilities is similar to skills, because I do not fall for the artistic anatomy of man drawing. But was it Galileo who did that? Where, this is normal man and this is how everyone's supposed to look. No, it's not. That sets up a most biased normative that is, it's idiotic. But there are so many scales and spectrums of ability that I have reduced ability on as a side effect of my brain damage, where it's several months I cannot remember. I have good short-term and long-term memory of other periods of time, and short-term is yesterday or 2 hours ago. That is the effect of the collision-caused traumatic brain injury type of disability I have with me now and will always have with me while this corpus walks on planet Earth.
Well, I know you to be a deeply faithful person and to be a very intellectually based faithful person, meaning that you really have engaged with a lot of the histories of faith as well as kind of what's in scripture. And I'm curious if your faith changed in any way after your injury. Like, was this always your orientation to be very deeply faithful, or did it change at all?
No, no, I say to the one question that you asked several of where I was coming from. Was it preceding my collision? No, it was not. It was of discovery of the healing love and presence of Jesus Christ upon I having a spiritual awakening to understand how it was the living word in my family members and even my partner, who is, as friends of mine who are part of the UUA would say, oh, he's an angry agnostic Catholic who hates church because he was raised in the Catholic Church. Yeah. Well, even I see in him the living word of, the logos of how he cared for me, that he cared for an unwanted man who looked disfigured. And I'm talking about myself, yet he still retained compassion and affection for me. And those are two different reactions you can have to ones you love: compassion and affection. He had both for me, and still does to this day, as I do for him. I saw in him great love, and it's taken, and I have even sitting on my desk the photos, Megan, of those who the spirit of compassion and help, and similar to what is told, I believe, in the Gospel of John, of the Good Samaritan, to help some waylaid and injured stranger on the road. Well, these two in San Francisco were going in the same direction as the driver who hit me was. They stopped their car, and it was at a decent time of day, like high noon, and even on the periphery in between Mission and Soma, which some would say even 20 years ago, that was a sketchball neighborhood. It still is today, even though it's got incredible San Francisco class dichotomy all around there. Extreme poverty except next to extreme wealth. Oh my gosh, that's another discussion. But these two got out of their car and tended to compassion to a stranger. She approached my injured, unconscious body and did what was smart compassion, which she provided compassion that was safe to her and me. She did not move me. She just said, help is on the way. And she may have done, even though I don't believe I was lacerated and bleeding out of the skin. I had many fractures, and I had a type of brain damage that was called subdural hematoma. So I was bleeding inside the brain. But she just may have like patted my hand, and he was waving his arms in the air. I think initially to alert other drivers that a collision had happened, to kind of leave, or to get not honk at them, or just kind of like, I don't think he believed he had orange cones to put out. I think the police later on, when they arrived, put flares down, even though they weren't looking, I wasn't shot, so they weren't looking for shells or bullets. But I'm sure that may occur elsewhere in the Mission. But these two people helped me, a total stranger, and then they followed the standard processes of the police when they report to a collision. Fill out the traffic collision reporting form 555, which is created by the state of California, that every responding officer, at least one of them, is to do it, be it a county sheriff or a firefighter or somewhere in the state of California. But these officers needed to record the names and contact information of all the witnesses and everyone who saw anything that related to that collision. Well, they filled out their data, so that information was in the hands of authorities. Well, the authorities, the police and the attorneys with the district attorney's officer, when the person who drove the car that hit me came back to the scene and responded to the officers to provide his name, and then I don't believe he was charged at the moment, but charges were later filed against him. He responded, or well, he went through 5 public defenders and a trial happened 2 years later. I testified at that trial, Megan, and so did those 2 witnesses who helped me at the collision location on Mission Street, just north of 14th Street. They agreed to testify at trial. And because they were not a cohort of the defendant, they were not subpoenaed, they could have denied the request to testify because they had to verify, and they did, even though situational to memory at 2 years out of the hospital, I may have heard what they said, but I have no recollection of what they said. They said, oh, the driver had a red light because we were going in the same direction as the driver was going, which countered his point that he was, I'm sure, guided by the public defender to state that, no, I, driver X, I won't say his name, even though I know it, I had the green light, and John, the victim, had a red light. And so he was breaking the law. I was not breaking the law. Well, it was determined by these 2 people as proof when they testified under oath that, oh, he did have a red light because that's what they witnessed. So those are 2 people that had good response of compassion to strangers, particularly for what is seen in that great example of that healing of by the Good Samaritan is one of the 53 healings. Well, wait a second. I'm not sure if Jesus does the healing. Is the Good Samaritan, the Logos works through the Good Samaritan. I don't think Jesus did a healing touch. The guy got better on his own. But I think that was a good example of the Logos working through people. And to do a brief segue over to the Bible. And this is Saint Paul of Tarsus. And I'm doing the whole title. I gotta include the Catholic angle point of view. Gotta put the whole title in there. Saint Paul of Tarsus, who wrote many of the epistles along with Timothy, his student or cohort, as they were on boats back and forth in the Mediterranean, going from this city and island to that, and to Rome, back and forth. He wrote in his first epistle to the people on the island of Corinth, a description he wrote of the organs that we are in the body of Christ, the weak and the strong. And this is the most clever, metaphorical, and so philosophical. I mean, I could just see that the philosophers in Athens must have somehow affected Paul's writing on this, because he was getting abstract in describing that he described in very, not metaphorically, at the end in verse 26 of 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 26. And no, I'm not saying it in Chaotic Greek. I haven't studied that yet. You know, if one is suffering, all are suffering. If one is glorified, all are glorified. I like that as it relates intra-connectivity. And that's an important word that I think to differentiate between being interconnected is intra, is more about being conjoint with each other than being stratified. And there's another S word that I believe you had instructed I and others when we served meals. We were under duty to periodically serve meals on Fridays at in the main room, the dining room at Old First Presbyterian Church, where you asked us to get, after we'd served the food, people had come up with trays or plates or whatever, then for we to get our own food and then eat with people And that's a form of compassion that I like, that is relates in kind of like God's thesaurus. You could say that is not, I wouldn't say a synonym, but it kind of is in the same family as empathy rather than sympathy of I on the regal horse flip a gold bullion to you, the smelly, stinky pauper. Get the hell out of my way. I need to get to my castle in Castile. So much has happened in my spiritual development, and the work of Jesus is carried on now, and particularly it's carried on by the compassionate nurses and doctors and first responders right now during this pandemic.
Absolutely. I'm so appreciative that you're sharing some of your biblical memory. It's a curious thing to be in awe of your biblical memory, knowing that your memory has been altered in such profound ways through the brain injury. But I kind of like, one of my favorite things about being in conversation with you is that the things that do stick and stay in there are like delightfully fascinating, right? And at least that's my interpretation of it. But I wonder if, have you had any encounters with faithful people who use those stories of Jesus's healings in ways that are what I would term spiritually abusive or unkind to people who, right? In the same way that some people out of their fear translated the idea of epilepsy into demons. Are there folk who out of their own fear or not knowingness have on purpose or on accident used their faith as a weapon?
Well, my eyes are looking up as I'm wondering to see if I recall any exact moment, and I cannot say anything that has been directly stated to me about myself or somebody I knew, or even being abstract or talking about somebody else. It's been more history I've read. And one example, and this was the format of how certain, and these are among Christians, view the Bible, how they interpret the statements by Jesus Christ, and how literal they take them. And this led to priests within the Catholic Church who did not have, and either the way that they were born with it or born without it, they were born without a right hand. And I think it was a right hand, that these men who are not priests were not allowed to become priests because they were not following as the Catholic rules of order, being filling in for Peter, being apostolic, filling in for the rock of the church, the right hand side of God. They weren't able to do that because they were missing the hand. And it was the reading of that disability as disqualifying them from having, you could say in their gut and soul, the skills and the calling to share the word of God through spoken word and acts of pastoral care. That to me didn't make a lick of sense.
Well, here's a twist to the question. How about as a gay man? Have you had an experience of people using faith in ways that cause injury due to the beloved in your life?
I do not recall being subject to direct disparagement because I am gay and I am openly gay, yet I do not, I don't want to say flaunt it, but wear it on my sleeve. It is part of my character. Sure. So I don't know if I've witnessed in the religious setting direct discrimination. There may have been subtle ones that I decided, and that's relative to being engaged with everyone in the room as being kind of as I think Sir Arthur Conan Doyle described it so eloquently in his character, Sherlock Holmes, how kind of like OCD observant he was of everybody in the room. And of course, the BBC TV show, which is like a modern version of it, with the actor Benedict Cumberbatch playing him, who is almost kind of like, it's almost a parody he's doing of being hyper observant. Maybe somebody who is hyper observant would know of someone arching their eyebrow when I laughed at and interpreted as a gay joke when someone was quoting the character Blanche Devereaux from the sitcom Golden Girls, who was played by actor Rue McClanahan, and this was a laughable, funny sitcom in the 80s on TV. It was hilarious, but because that's kind of known as gay humor, and kind of like it was so catty in a gay way, it would bring out kind of like if I would screech my voice, and if I had rouged chapstick on, I would purse my lips and try and do Blanche Devereaux scene and cackle and mimic her, but I don't have that on me at the moment, so I won't try and feign it.
Next time. Is there anything about being a person with a traumatic brain injury that you wish people would read about on their own and not ask you questions about in person?
I've not had a personal encounter that has led me to feel that way, but in principle, I feel that people kind of like ought to learn more about it, because even though I could say my brother-in-law is a doctor, and I've had many friends and family members who have had disabling ailments, either they short-term or permanent, I can say in general, I feel that every person at some point in their life will have a disabling health condition that affects their capability to feed themselves, vote, drive a car, or go to work or something like that, which is standard activities in life. And this is relative, Megan. I think it's worthwhile understanding how is a disability defined in the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is defined, and it was updated in 2008, where they changed from one health condition to health conditions. And I think this word, I'm not sure if it's reduced or halts, but reduces one's capabilities to work. It's not enjoy, smell the flowers. It's not defined, read a book. It's defined on capacity to work. That is how a disability is defined. Not, and because there's so many different types, they just kind of had to find a commonality to bring them all together, because the list is so long. I think there's 198 different types of disabilities out there. So it's a big scale out there of health conditions that people have. So it's not brought about a distressing situation where someone's asked me about it, but I sure hope that people would read about it. It's worth one. Here's a history fact for you. President Harry Truman, who became president after Franklin Delano Roosevelt died of a disabling condition that I believe was polio. And he just filled out Act 176 in 1945, which created a week in the month of October we just left, which was created National Week of Employment Awareness for the handicapped. And the term changed over time, and it got expanded from a week to a month. So it's now called Disability Employment Awareness Month. So employers ought to be aware of, and honestly, employers need to read the Americans with Disabilities Act, particularly the title in the ADA that talks about, frankly, what's that word accommodations mean? And what does it mean if I have 3 or 4 applicants and I know from the cover letter that applicant X has a prosthetic leg because they lost that leg because they have diabetes? Does that affect their capability to become the accountant in my design firm? Even though everyone else is also an accountant, but the others don't have diabetes, this one has it and is also missing a leg. Does that mean that but wait a second, what does the ADA say about this? And what will be the outcome if I tell them I'm not hiring them because they have the disability of diabetes and do not have a leg? I need to read the ADA.
Yeah, someone lifted up in the chat box that there's also some language in the American Disabilities Act about disabilities that substantially alter your ability to do life activities. So I just wanted to lift that up from the chat. I also want to remind people that if they'd like to lift up any questions, that this would be a great time to do so. We have about a half hour left in our conversation. So if you want to type in any questions in the chat on Facebook Live or in the Q&A box on Zoom, this would be a lovely time for you to do that. Would you be willing to talk a bit, John, about ways that congregations can be a more supportive and welcoming place for people with traumatic brain injuries?
Yes. And this, I don't believe I would directly relate this to traumatic brain injuries, but it is broadly put to people with disabilities who, preceding an event that's coming up, have expressed their general desire to assist the pastor to serve communion, that they I would hope, and this is the methodology of how to educate the pastor, to phrase a question, an offer of assistance question is how there is the straightforward, if its tone of voice question can really affect how it comes across. Please, I need someone to stand next to me to hold the platter of bread. Would you like to do that? There's different tones of voice and phraseology in offering the questions to how would you like to do that? It's a scale of questions that relates to, in general terms, the pastor or the fellow minister's familiarity with that person's disability, their willingness to want to be involved, but know that there's a certain scale. So is how implies it's a spectrum, to say that they have a certain method that they may be able to offer, but it is not an absolute condition, either yes or no. And I think that is what people with disabilities want to know, is how they can be involved, not be subject to an either or fork in the road.
Yeah, and I liked the way you described the exact task that needed to be done so that people could discern if they could do that exact task. Like if what someone wants is, can you stand here and hold this plate? That's a very different question than, can you help me with communion, and not knowing what all those tasks might be. And so I appreciated that phrasing of, and that probably I'm imagining can apply to lots of different volunteer requests, of like being more specific about the kinds of help people need, where it would take place if it's accessible to get to that place, what's the lowest level of help that person needs, and what are the cognitive functioning that tasks might need. But just being more specific about tasks, I think, is a really wonderful example.
It is, and you used, and I'm glad you brought up this word, and I used up another A word called accommodations, which is, it's assistance, help, but accessibility. And see, accessibility, to play alliteration, there's other words that begin with A that also reflect, within my denomination, the United Church of Christ, called accessible to all, A to A. It's A is also about, is the first letter in the word attitude and affirmation. And A in the English language is the middle letter of two words. One word I prefer over the other one. And both are phrased in a question you pose to somebody who it's evident to you and them that they have a disability. You ask them how they would like to be involved in doing something at the church. And the question that reflects attitude towards that person, of both affirming them, is the word may. A is the middle letter of may. A is also the middle letter of the word can. Can you reach the top shelf and get down the decanter containing the grape juice? Or it's the word may, because see, can in the dictionary, come on folks, let's look up to see the word we're using, can in the dictionary, that's an ability word. Do you have the ability? And I've even seen a moment of critique of kind of like, it's almost like a comedic moment. Are you asking me, do I have the ability to grab the decanter from the top shelf? No, I don't. Why don't you ask me some other thing rather than ask me if I have the ability? Can I get the decanter off the top shelf? No, I can't. So why'd you pose that question? We prefer the word, and we, I'm speaking on general on behalf of many others that I know with disabilities, prefer the word may in request for assistance.
One of the things that I've appreciated about you in a worship setting is that your congregation is in a busy part of San Francisco where sometimes folk come to church who have very differing abilities to follow what might be that community's expectation of silence and stillness, right? Silence and stillness comes from a cultural way of being in church. And I've been in church services where when someone was disruptive of the cultural expectation of silence and stillness, that you have been kind of a support person for that individual because you didn't have assumptions that their inability to be calm or still was intentionally trying to harm the congregation. And just by simply checking in with that person about what they might need or what they're trying to communicate, I've seen you sit with people and help them understand the cultural expectations of other people around them to facilitate what they're needing, and also to like still treat them as a child of God in the midst of other people being very fearful about this thing that's happening that their brain is not understanding why it's happening in a church space. And so I've personally been very appreciative as someone who, you know, for 12 years straight ate with people who were homeless and operated in the world in a very different way that oftentimes felt discordant to other people's assumptions. To just see the way that you could be patient and calm and display compassion in the midst of a worship service, for me, has been a really lovely teaching moment. And I know that as addiction issues become more prevalent across the United States, as mental health issues become more prevalent across the United States, we might not be worshiping in person as much right now. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what your intent is when you're caring for people in that space. Because I really firmly believe that if we can learn ways to be better mechanisms of the logos of love that you talked about, as when we come back to congregations, that will be a real gift to communities of faith. Can you speak a little bit about how you are present in worship, particularly when there might be a disruption? Maybe it's from addiction, maybe it's from a mental health issue, or maybe it's a traumatic brain injury, but the way that you're kind of a minister to folk in that space.
Well, thank you for posing that question. And I do recall the worship service where I had engaged compassion and pastoral care in the narthex with somebody who was engaged in sudden what I call disruptive behavior, particularly as he was quite close in sitting to a parent with their young child. And I feel on scale of people who are vulnerable, I think a young child is really, 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 really vulnerable to someone who's going through erratic behavior and gesturing quickly in the air. And that's what they were doing. So what I'm describing is a little bit of an example, as I was attentive to what was happening in the room. And that is a scale of kind of something that I just have part of my character, but somebody at least should have the duty during worship service as to be the kind of the scout or the observer of the room if someone is about to nod off or for whatever reason, whatever conditions causing it, that they're about to do something that they wouldn't want to have happen, that you can help them, or to somebody who's doing a behavior that can be a symptom of their illness or a side effect which can of the substance that they're using for their illness, which I can say slurred speech or sudden moments caused by narcotics because of the addiction, the illness of addiction, is that there be somebody who is observant in the room. And that's part of the praxis that I appreciate in my church. And that's a familiarizing yourself of shared greeting with everybody. So everyone gets on the same kind of, to go over to kind of realm of like spiritual physics. It's on the same plane that we all greet each other. So we all know each other. We've all kind of like created pathways of ministry. And particularly that's what we in the First Congregational Church of San Francisco like. It's kind of our congregational MO of being on the same level of everybody in the room. That's what I like. And I think that's what is necessary in a modern church in San Francisco. And with the factor you described of addiction and how responsive churches are. And I believe at church, Megan, I heard you co-officiate a panel discussion with the police officers, being responsive to a panel of members of Glide Memorial United Methodist Church, which was their name 2 years ago. I don't know if they've changed the UMC part, the reason after they've left the denomination or not, and who knows. But it was regarding Glide, what they've learned in their ministry since Cecil Williams started it, I think 60 years ago, in his ministry to people with addictions in the Tenderloin, of how responsive they were to people with addictions who had symptoms of them, particularly when you have this super strong stimulant narcotic, which metaphorically it was called the rock. But when the rock landed from I'm talking about crack cocaine in the mid 80s, with how that affected people with addiction who are on it and the behavior. I can't say I've seen somebody on it, but from how I've seen it depicted in, TV crime drama shows, it can lead to sudden outbursts of energy. But I'm sure that the ushers and those, you could say, with eagle eyes in the room know how to scope and assess people in the room who they can tell by greeting someone coming in, having looked at their pupils. Are they dilated? Well, they need to be monitored, which I been told this, and I can't say if I recall I've ever seen somebody with dilated pupil and known afterwards that they were on narcotics, to say if that's a good distinguishing factor that a modern usher at a music hall or a church or city hall in San Francisco, or the main library. Address is 100 Larkin Street is the address of the main library. They know a lot about people with addictions at that facility. Lord, they do.
Are there things that you can think of that individuals should do? I know you said people should familiarize themselves with the ADA language. Are there additional things you think individuals should do?
I feel when a nonprofit that is generalized to be about people with disabilities, which in San Francisco, it's called the Independent Living Resource Center on Howard Street between 4th and 5th, when it has an open forum meeting where it is known people with disabilities will be there and the public is invited to go to it. And there is a section in that room where you can have a discussion or a talk with somebody, that it be a discussion between two people. Or if the person has both a visual and hearing impairment and needs an interpreter, that there's a third person, kind of to triangulate the discussion, that the two come and share with each other, not just be the person with the disability is the teacher, that it's a sharing moment, that both share with each other, that you need to be on the same pedagogical plane. That's a good forum where I invite people to determine if there is an event that is stated as an event, first of all. So you would need to do some research beforehand. So to have friendly discussions with people with disabilities where they want to and you want to have it both as a learning discussion. That sounds good to me.
Yeah. One of the things that you mentioned earlier was you were talking about Bible verses that were helpful for you. Are there other Bible verses that you would recommend to people to look into to think about these issues?
Yes. Okay, this is the one healing of the 53 healings by Jesus where it's unique. In the English language version, it's the only person who's named in the Bible as one who is healed. And this is a blind roadside, I'm not sure if he's called a beggar, but something like that, who is waiting on the roadside. I think in the Gospel of Mark, maybe chapter 14, maybe. His name is Bartimaeus, and I think in Hebrew, Bar means son of, so his father was called Timaeus, which I think is something about shoes, maybe, or leather. Well, he is wanting to be healed by Jesus, but he's told by the others to, shut up. And that Jesus responds, and this reflects Jesus' attitude as almost like a babysitter attitude towards those who are being disrespectful and cold and calculative to this man who has will in himself to be healed by Jesus. And later on, after he's cured of his blindness, Jesus says to him, "Oh, your faith has made you see." But Jesus says to the people around him, who Jesus hears them telling him to shut up and scurry away, all he says to them is, "Get him here." And it reflects, it's a learning moment, it's almost like a narrative moment. It's one of the narrative healings that Jesus does, because that's all he regards them. He does not lecture them. He's not speaking directly to, he's not chiding them. He just values them as almost like, I'm not sure, like chattel minions, but something like that, because he's showing them the little respect that they have given Bartimaeus by just telling them, like, little chattel slaves of the king of Israel, which in Jesus's timeline, it was preceding his kind of glory on the mountain time, where he was kind of still known, and this is the Gospel of Mark, where he was still known as kind of like the snake oil salesman who could cure all, people of leprosy. They were limited understanding who he was the Messiah. It was more kind of like he was the fix-it man. So people didn't have it in their guts and soul who he was, but Bartimaeus did. And he was treating them situationally kind of like how they were treating others. And I hope, and I think he was speaking to them when he was speaking to me and to everyone else who reads that healing, that it was faith in healing, faith when it really, really sucks, when you keep your will and love, when people are treating you like crap based on that you are eyeless or jawless or toothless, or you have blackened Kaposi sarcoma, cancer on your skin that looks like a modern version of leprosy, which, by the way, that's an antiquated term. It's now called Hansen's disease. I don't know who renamed it, but that's what it's now called. But to how people are regarded with particular visually evident ailments, that they should not be viewed as a societal scum, that they have will, that they are a person with a health condition that honestly, every gerontologist who is worth their medical credentials can verify it. You're going to have a disabling stroke where you will have reduced capacity of memory, sensory abilities, and based on which side of your brain the stroke happened, you may have a certain scale of reduced mobility. And if you stop using your right arm, you will develop what's called atrophy, which is shrinkage of the muscles, which quick jump back 19 years in the timeline. That's what I got when I was a bed-laden, intubated patient in the hospital, is I got atrophy. And my physical therapist didn't do a good enough job because I had started to use the walker, but this is medical care credentials that one who is injured with a disabling injury like I was, and you have family members, and this would be, Megan, yours responsibility to remind family members who's now caring at home for Jane, I'm making this up, for Jane, who was stabbed in a robbery in the Tenderloin. Tell the family members, because Jane, as it was described by witnesses, Jane saw what happened to her. So Jane saw the knife. Tell the family members, because Jane will have what's called PTSD. So if Jane sees any knives in the house, she will start breathing heavily. And because she's still, the muscles were torn in her stomach and she's got terrage, if she starts breathing heavily and gasping, she's gonna it's gonna hurt her muscles, and it's gonna really hurt her a lot to start doing a panic attack. For them to remove the knives that are evident from the kitchen drawers, or to not have anything that looks like a knife, which some older desks have letter openers, which are kind of in the shaped, kind of like in old antiquated English desks, in the shape of like a miniature sword, like a letter opener. but even the image of that for Jane, may not like. So that's a form of care that family members can have for someone who has an injury, and I had fared such as I described with my atrophy in my muscles and my legs after my injury, and that what happened to people who've had a stroke on their side of their body. And a stroke is one of the health conditions that often comes later on in life. I've learned a lot about brain damage as, yes, TBI. A stroke is called ABI. There is an M word, which a neurologist would tell you this. Meningitis leads to the brain condition, which is also called ABI, which A stands for acquired brain injury. A T stands for traumatic brain injury, which is a side effect of being hit in the head with a bat or being flung, as I was, through the air because a car hit me on my left side and momentum flung me through the air. And the collision, the injury to my brain happened mostly upon my impact with gravity landing on the road. So that's a difference there between ABI and TBI, but a stroke is one of the neurological conditions that is an ABI.
Your words about Bible stories made me think of something I don't know that I'd thought about in the past. And that's when you talked about the words that Jesus said to have the person brought to them, that Jesus says to the man, get him to me, basically, rather than assuming that person has to figure out their own functioning. For me, it's kind of a call for communities to make it possible for people with disabilities of various natures to be able to come to sacred spaces, which was the opposite of what the rules of the temple were in during that time frame. And I think the story earlier in Mark of them carrying the man and finding a way to hoist him down through the roof so that he could be there with Jesus is another one of those examples of it's not good safety practice like ADA. I wouldn't recommend people try to bring people with disabilities in through the roof right now. But I also think of the man with the described as the withering hand, but for the sake of our conversation, we'll call it the man with atrophy in his hand, and who gets healed even though the timing is off, right? The timing is off, and still gets to be in the center of the worship space. It's that the story makes it sound like it's in the middle of almost even the sermon of what Jesus is up to, and so these rules of that, where people whose bodies were different were not allowed into the holy places, didn't seem to be rules that Jesus was following. That Jesus was calling for folk to communally make sure that folk could come to where God was, but also then when people were upset, I think most of the time when we have the conversation about the person whose hand had atrophy, we talk about like Sabbath because Jesus made it a thing about timing, but the big deal was that that person was in the room at all, right? And so we forget that it was this kind of earth-shattering, rule-breaking thing for that person to be in the room at all. And so I'm just delighted that you've been able to lift up some of the ways that folk whose bodies are different, folk whose brains are different, maybe, well, so here I can say it this way: is I didn't know you prior to your diagnosis of a brain injury, right? But I know you to be someone who is full of faith, and you've shared that faith maybe came as a response of this injury. I know you to be someone who's very thoughtful and compassionate and who lives their life in a praxis or in an ethical outward way that is intentionally seeking to care for people on a level of equality. And so, you know, if that means that our way of being in the world is different than the powers and the principalities expect us to behave, then there is a way. I don't wish everyone gets hit by a car. In fact, I wish the opposite, right? But there is a way in which I wish all of our brains were oriented to love and oriented towards compassion and oriented to a lot of the things that you embody in the world. So I wanted to make sure I said that before our time was up.
Well,
I'm also aware that this week alone, there have been 3 individuals who have been hit by cars here in San Francisco. I believe all 3 of them died. But I've seen calls here in San Francisco, and I'm hoping that there are similar efforts in other cities that faith communities will put on their radar caring for people who are pedestrians in collision accidents, to help care for when they're thinking about how cities are built, to try to prioritize human lives and human bodies over I don't know, fast vehicles that maybe can do a lot of damage. And so I know that you've been participating in a lot of the efforts to make speed limits lower and to help to activate for common sense ways that people can not become victims of pedestrian car or pedestrian municipal transit accidents. And so having heard that there is a call for faith communities in their prayer life to care about these issues, and being here with such a faithful person, do you have any ideas about language we can use in our prayer life that could be helpful to think more about these issues, or well, do you have any words of prayer that could help us think about some of these issues?
It's a 3-letter word that can be the first word in a question to God or to the lead minister in a house of worship. It is the word how. How may I help with the program to okay, I'm making this up, turn our church into a Saturday evening sanctuary to people who are homeless when there are Halloween festivities occurring outside. Because I know beforehand that people who are homeless, when everyone is screaming around them for candies and their costumes, that they won't like that. But I want to help create a space of respect. So I'm, in a way, you see me rambling on about it. I really want to do it. How can I help? Is there anybody here in this church that's done it before that we can put in a program for that evening? I want to help out, but how may I do it? Do you, Pastor, know of anybody else here who's done it before? Because I just joined a year ago, and you guys, you've been, I guess, around a while. So how can I help? So how?
I love that. I love that way of questioning, because it's assuming that the faithful people will want to join you, right? It's assuming, of course, they'll want to do that. And it's really just about like seeing the best way to facilitate it. And I also see in that question a trauma-informed worship space, right? Being a worship space that can anticipate what might trigger the community around it, and seeing how it can care for folk when those triggers might be inflamed. And a lot of folk who experience traumatic brain injuries are in the veteran community. And I always think about that every year with when the Blue Angels fly over top, like especially those living outdoors who have no way to get away from the noises of those bombers essentially flying through town, and people who have refugees who have come to the United States and for whom those sounds were accompanied by bomb blasts, and just being a trauma-informed sanctuary, right? A sanctuary where if you can anticipate triggers that people will have, that you ask, how can this building be a place of sanctuary against those triggers in the world? That's a really beautiful way to think about it.
That is, I'm glad you brought that up, and I thought of this before we began at 2:00. As I recall in my studies at Pacific School of Religion, I learned in my studies about denominational ministry of Christian denominations regarding people with disabilities. And this does relate to veterans. And yes, that's what we learned as an outcome of the veterans coming back from Iraq. And because there was a great preponderance of people with TBI coming back, that they did not know how to address it because it was the side effect, so to speak, of the weapons that were being used, those buried bombs, I don't know if they were called landmines or something like that. Was it called IEDs or something like that?
Yeah, IEDs and landmines.
Yeah. But as they were coming back, of how churches could respond to those with, say, TBI or any other type of combat caused short-term or long-term permanent disabling health condition. And I learned that the ELCA, the denomination that Grace Lutheran is part of, I think passed a resolution, I think probably 12 or 13 years ago, where they were to welcome veterans with disabilities to a Lutheran church. That's a scaled word, Lutheran. In the Lutheran church, or frankly, any church, welcome is so scaled on you accept, allow, advocate for, abstractly, or affirm, or I don't know, it would be another A word, recruit. I mean, that's commodification, which to me sounds like a callous form of turning your congregation into a diverse setting of people of different demographic ID qualifiers, but that people with disabilities who are veterans can come in and not have what is standardly understood and encouragedly used to replicate the sound effects of, I'm not sure if there is I don't know, if you were to do a moment of scenes of, I'm not sure what battle scenes are necessary. I'm not that good as you are in trying to recall all the different scenarios in the Bible, but in moments of soldiers clamoring about with music, with swords in sheaths, and I don't think there's any guns in the Bible necessarily, but swords, yeah. But see, even the sight of and sound of, and you described the Blue Angels, I know of the former pastor of a church in Fresno, where my mother is, when he was installed as the pastor of this church, is he had served in Vietnam. And the effect of symbols. And no. I'm talking about, it's the symbol, the words, a musical instrument that begins with a C, not symbol like with an S. But that clanging of sudden bang, bang metal reminded him of, tanks or gunfire, or I'm not sure if he was in the Tet Offensive or whatnot, but that reminded him of where he was injured in Vietnam. And I don't think he liked that at all. And I think it caused him to resign. And did he let that church know up front? Was he kind of allowed to, or encouraged to, or told beforehand by recruiters, do not mention that you were in the Tet Offensive and that you were discharged from the military because of acts of cowardice in the Tet Offensive? I don't know. Of course, I'm being Monty Python over dramatizing it. It's just a little example.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And hopefully the good news is that during this time of sheltering in place, people are able to be a little bit more honest about their triggers and about what's going on for them mental health wise. And I'm really grateful for your time with us today. I know we're just after 3:30, so I want to make sure we can get you back.
We need to scurry on.
But I'm so delighted that you spent this time with us, and it's always a lovely thing to get to be in your company. So thank you for joining us, John.
Thank you, Megan.
Mwah.
Cum Deus e pluribus unum.
Yes. And also with you. Love you lots. Take care, John.